Good morning, everybody. Hello, my name is Isabel Guerrero. I am going to be moderating your session today. I'm also part of the executive committee of the Global Community of Practice. And I want to give you a very warm welcome to what I think is going to be a very exciting panel today. This is the second session of the 5th annual workshop of this community of practice. We have around 700 members now. And this is a community of practice which is completely voluntary, and it's focused on advancing the practice of scaling up by different sectors, geographies. We have several subgroups of the community of practice working in very interesting issues such as nutrition, climate change, social entrepreneurs. You can see a list of them in our website, which is going to be launched on October 30. Before turning to what our panelists are going to talk about, we want to share a bit about where you all are today. So Smiti, could we share a slide about where people are coming from? We had yesterday a survey that I hope you answered, which will show you where you're all coming from. So we can see that a lot of you are coming from NGOs or social enterprises, some from research, academic, and think tank. Very varied geographic presence from Sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East, South Asia, Europe, a lot of North America, and some on Latin America. So a very varied group, which is going to make a really interesting conversation. In terms of sectors, also, all over the sectors that we cover in the community of practice: agriculture, education, health, nutrition, youth employment, social enterprise, climate change, monitoring and evaluation, fragile states, which are all the groups actually that form part of this community of practice. And then half of you are part of the community of practice today and half are not. So this is going to be a lively conversation, I hope. We're going to start with the panelists, and then we're going to go back to you with a poll, and then with questions about our conversation. So let me start by introducing Amar Bhattacharya. Amar Bhattacharya is a very distinguished colleague in the World Bank. We worked together for many years. But more importantly, he has been working on sustainable development and on the new climate economy with Nick Stern, and he's the co-lead of the Sustainable Growth and Finance Initiative of the new climate economy under the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. He's going to be our first panelist, and you will really enjoy the depth of his knowledge. So I'm really looking forward. The second panelist is Jeremy Shoham, who has worked in nutrition over 35 years. Preparing for this, we had a fascinating conversation how he has been both working on nutrition and humanitarian settings, first in academia, but then through Nutrition Works, and has just founded, after 25 years working in Nutrition Works, a new organization, N4D, very much focused on the issue of nutrition movements and what is happening around the world. Our third panelist is Hisham Jabi, who has worked many years on youth development and employment. Today, he's working in the Chief Economist Office of the World Bank, but he has extensive experience on youth and organizational development, both as a training in conflict, post-conflict development, and in designing and implemented youth and community programs in conflict settings. So we have a very interesting panel with really crucial issues in development today. So Larry Cooley, who's one of the founders of this Scaling Up community of practice, always says there are three ways of scaling up. One way is to grow your own organization and scale up your impact. A second way is to find something that really works and have it replicated by others. And a third way is what he calls collaboration, is when people who care about a similar issue all get together behind this issue with much looser association in terms of the branding of what they're doing, but all focus on the same development objective. And this is the case of movements across the world that we have seen in the last few years really intensified. We have important movements on the climate change arena, which are led by young people, but also connecting to what was already there before that. We have a worldwide nutrition movement, which has meant that there has been continuity in the policies because of the pressure that these movements have put on policymakers, regardless of what political party is in power. And the third one, of course, the famous youth movements, which were the first ones to really use the internet in a way that helped them organize and bring change. Not all has been as successful as we hoped, but it's a very important movement to tap on. So we're going to start with Amar, with the question of how has the global narrative shifted in climate change, given these movements, because of these movements, and what does it mean for scaling up of the climate change agenda? Over to you, Amar.
Thank you, Isabel. I hope you can see and hear me clearly.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about, just by way of preface, about the science of climate change and the economics of climate change, and how against that backdrop, the difficult landscape on scaling up and the politics of climate change. So the science of climate change is worrying, but ever more clear. We know that climate change is happening. It is accelerating, and with it, the costs and the risks are mounting. There's a process of actually stakeholder engagement of scientists in this area that is extremely impressive. And the science, 99.9% of scientists are very, very aligned and agreed upon, what has to happen. Second, on the economics of climate change, in the beginning, the economists really looked at climate change as a constrained optimization. It was a constraint and hence a cost. And in a way, economics really didn't fully appreciate the time horizon. They thought that there would be possibilities to act on, and so they did not, in some sense, recognize as strongly as they should have the urgency of climate change. However, that narrative has been changing. Economics now recognizes that climate change is a cost, but the shift to low carbon climate resilient growth is an important opportunity, and with important co-benefits such as reduced congestion, reduced pollution, better health, and the like. Last point on the economics that's extremely important, as that scale is of paramount importance, because you have to bring about changes in the stock of capital, and you have to bring about changes in the stock of future capital. So scale becomes absolutely intrinsic in addressing climate change. Now, against that backdrop, we have been a little bit, let's say, thwarted by the politics of climate change. Climate change has been tackled essentially as an intergovernmental activity, starting with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And it is fair to say that this intergovernmental processes over the last 22 years have produced very meager results. They have not led to the kind of ambitious or aggressive or scaled up action that is needed. In a way, Paris Agreement in 2015 was a deal breaker, but as you know, the US has withdrawn from the Paris, it will withdraw from the Paris Agreement formally the same day as the US elections. So much will depend on the US elections, but the intergovernmental process at the same time has been given an infusion coming out of Europe, an agreement on net zero, a very milestone commitment by China to go to net zero by 2060. So there is movement on the intergovernmental front, but increasingly, as Isabel was suggesting, the momentum is moving outside from the intergovernmental or the state to, let's say, other actors. And there are three sets of actors that I want to highlight. The increasing importance of subnational actors, especially cities. In the case of the US, there's something called the America's Pledge, where the cities and non-state actors have come together to be operating in the Paris Agreement outside the federal government, for example, increasing networks of cities happening across the world, all kinds of networks to drive climate action. The second very important part, which is really a phenomena of the last 2 or 3 years, I would say, is the private sector is increasingly getting ahead of the state in terms of responding to climate change. There are tremendous alliances that are being built up, a recognition that we have to build back better from the COVID crisis, and that the changes that we are seeing might be changes that offer permanent opportunity rather than transitory change. You know, private sector in not just in terms of investment, but in terms of finance and portfolios coming in strongly behind net zero. There's even an alliance called the Net Zero Alliance of asset owners of the world, accounting for 13 trillion of assets right now. And last but not least, global citizenry is increasingly getting now involved. In the last COP in Madrid, there were 27,000 participants. You know, 20,000 of them were really global citizens, and especially young people. And you should have seen the power, the energy, not just inside the room, but when Greta Thunberg went out and marched in the streets of Madrid. And we have now tremendous energy coming from young people, and that can really be a force of change. But we need to actually build on that. For example, here in the United States, I would still argue that universities, for example, are not as acutely aware of, as acutely conscious of the power that they have in pushing the agenda on climate change. So yes, we are doing well in terms of all these dimensions, but if we really need to bring the change at the scale and at the pace that is needed, the mobilization of all stakeholders and holding world leaders to account will be a very important force in bringing about the change that we need. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you, Amar. That's really makes me feel very optimistic. A lot is happening under the radar and not so under the radar. So it's wonderful you can bring this to our attention. Jeremy, over to you now to tell us about another global movement, but this time on nutrition.
Thank you, Isabel. It's very interesting listening to Amar there about how the impetus behind climate change has escalated so critically, because nutrition over many years has the interest has ebbed and flowed. Nutrition is very often seen as a kind of invisible problem. It's very easy for it to be invisible. Most often it takes place in, malnutrition takes place in the countryside away from key decision makers. And that's been part of its problem over many years. Now I'm going to talk to you about the SUN movement, the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, which I've been very involved in for the last 5 years. This movement came out of a series in The Lancet in 2008. And in that series on nutrition, it stated very clearly that we can only deal with 20% of malnutrition in the world using the kind of interventions we've employed up until then, which are commonly known as nutrition-specific interventions. This is very direct interventions, the likes of vitamin A, supplementation, or feeding specialized foods to malnourished children. This Lancet series set out a very different way of approaching the underlying causes of malnutrition. It set out what we call a multi-sector approach to dealing with undernutrition. And it said the 80% of malnutrition that we can't deal with has to be addressed by this multi-sector approach. Now, in order to get a multi-sector approach, obviously you need all sectors coming together that can influence malnutrition and coordinating in a way that has one clear or a series of agreed and aligned objectives. The Sun movement actually kicked off in 2010, and it has had its first 2 phases. 63 countries and 3 Indian states signed up to the Sun movement over this period. And we are now entering its 3rd phase. The way the Sun movement has tried to work has been quite simple, really. First of all, it's tried to identify political champions in country who will promote and try to persuade government to spend more on nutrition. It's also tried to set up what are called multi-stakeholder platforms. That means getting all the sectors together in one room, if you like, regularly, and planning together to tackle malnutrition. It also involves not just government sectors, but UN, donors, INGOs, and the private sector. These platforms then come up with a common results framework or a national nutrition plan. And there is one person charged in government called the government focal point who is responsible for making all this happen. It is a voluntary post. Now, the approach then has been what the Sun movement called to build an enabling environment, and that is to get the political systems in country aligned around key objectives of scaling up multi-sector nutrition. Obviously, the emphasis is also on getting governments to spend more on nutrition and also getting international donors to align behind the country nutrition plans. The Sun movement set very clear targets aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the World Health Assembly targets for nutrition. And the work over the last 10 years has been very impressive in terms of creating more of an enabling environment around nutrition. That's the good news. The bad news is that there has been very little monitoring of what actually has taken place on the ground. The degree to which these multi-sector programs have been scaled up, even though we have the enabling environment in place in country. Another challenge has been the protracted nature of crisis in many of these 63 countries. A lot of them are fragile and conflict-affected countries. And a further challenge has been getting sectors to actually work together, because it's quite difficult to get a non-nutrition sector like water and sanitation or social protection or agriculture to take on nutrition objectives. Although the theory is great, to get sectors to buy in to what has hitherto not been their concern or responsibility has proven challenging. The evidence is that countries are making progress towards these nutrition targets, that domestic spend on nutrition has increased in some countries, but it's extremely variable. And Sun, in its 3rd phase, which will start next year, is trying to change the way it's doing things in a number of ways. It's trying to ensure that the government focal point, who has all this responsibility, is a proper funded position from now on and gets a great deal more support than hitherto has been the case. Also, international finance is aligning around more innovative financing, and the recently cancelled Nutrition for Growth conference was going to be a forum in which international donors would commit more to nutrition and help governments do the same. I think this next phase is probably the last chance for the Sun movement, because if it doesn't show progress, there is a sense that the interest in nutrition will wane, as has happened in the past 30, 40 years ago. And it's interesting that some of the donors who have been big players in nutrition over the last few years are now turning their attention more to climate change. So donors like the Irish government, nutrition is now being absorbed into the climate change and food security system portfolio. So this is probably a critical 5 years for the Sun movement. I'll stop there.
Wow. So first of all, what I love about this idea of the whole movement, thinking about that Lancet 2008 nutrition series, it was such a game changer. I remember working at that point in India. We were struggling, lending billions of dollars to a nutrition project, getting nowhere, and then looking at the Lancet and saying, wow, that's why. Connecting to what Amar was saying, the importance of having research, and connecting to what we're going to talk about with Hisham, the importance of having goals that are clear and shared and plans to get there. The implementation, of course, is where the rubber hits the road, and sorry to hear that that's not going that well, but we will come back to that. Thank you. Hisham, over to you.
Good morning. Can you hear me, Isabel?
Yes, very well.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Isabel and colleagues. I appreciate the opportunity. Isabel, you introduced everybody, but I just want to say that I co-chair the Youth Employment Work Group, which is free and open for everybody. So I welcome any participation for contribution around sharing best practices, knowledge, and workable tools around scaling up. So please, if you are interested, let us know. You know, I always think about like a workable youth employment model. This is not necessarily scalable youth employment model, because as Larry Cooley always say, getting a workable model, theory of change correctly does not mean by any means having the theory of change of scaling up that model to getting it right. So having a successful model doesn't mean having a scalable model. That's fair. Second, I think youth employment has multiple addresses. If you go to do any youth employment program in any country, you have to struggle to find the right address, because TVET is part of the game, education part of the game, private sector, parents, and so you have a multi-stakeholder, like many disciplines, but youth per se is a little bit different and challenging. Before I make my few remarks very quickly about how to scale up or what works in scaling up youth employment through changing the narrative and building political consensus and pursuing social movement, I just would like you to hold an image in your mind of a group of young people between the age of 19 and 25, let's say, sitting together in a coffee shop in Colombia or Kenya or maybe Yemen or even Malaysia, and imagine actually what they're talking about, what they're discussing, what kind of aspiration and challenges they are facing, from COVID to employment to concern about themselves, their community. So just hold to that image while we just imagining the whole notion of what can young people do to change the narrative. Just hold that image and we come back to it. But even before COVID came, that technology disruption and automation really put youth employment at the top of the agenda for donors, government, and community. And because you know there's a significant change in the whole concept of workforce and what needed and what kind of skills are actually private sector looking for. And so this has been a challenge even before COVID. So imagine now with COVID and imagine the challenges that host government are facing, that actually added a lot of challenge. So I think youth unemployment is the next big pandemic that many countries and emerging markets are actually not will be facing. because particularly youth and women have been hit hard during COVID in terms of unemployment and work. The World Bank report that came last week actually is anticipating 90 to 100 million, almost 1.4 million of the world population will go into extreme poverty. And as we all know, that young people are actually working mainly in the informal sector. So due to many reasons, I don't want to go through the reasoning, but that's a fact in many emerging countries. So youth unemployment is basically becoming a major issue at scale, because it is the scale of the problem is the scope of the problem in our case. And in certain countries, you have 80 to 85% of the industry are micro enterprises from 1 to 5. Maybe MENA is an example. So you're talking about like hard hit, youth and women in this regard. In terms of education also, the magnitude of the challenge is 300, I think UNICEF anticipated 300 million students were outside of schooling in March. But the challenge is, given all what I just said, I don't want to just sound pessimistic, but youth are doing something and government are doing something. But scaling up business as usual, given what I described, does not really work anymore, really, because that concept of incremental expansion or growth sometimes doesn't work given what we are facing now. So there is some need now for young people to be in the driver's seat. Youth, as I said, is different and has a multiple address. So you don't see significant example of youth movement about employment, but there are a lot of examples of youth leading change around their role in the society and what their needs are. So the whole notion of collaboration, the whole notion of changing cultural norms and pursuing strategic political consensus is very important for young people to put the work and job agenda on the top of policymakers. So I think, the previous approach of 1 to 2, even to 5% target for unemployed youth in certain countries does not serve the purpose, given that what COVID and technology disruption creating. And actually the reality, talking to young people last maybe 15 years in different parts of the world, if you dig deeper, young people are not only asking or pursuing movement and change to find jobs. They really be active citizen and agent for positive change, because job is manifestation for empowerment, manifestation of being active. So I remember right after the Tunisia Arab Spring and demonstration, I was talking to Aisha from Tetouan in Morocco, and I remember she said something I will never forget. She said, young Tunisians need jobs with dignity. We seek respect before salaries. It was really powerful statement. So I think we just also need to put employment in the context of the multifaceted youth needs, because employed youth but not mentally healthy youth, maybe that they don't produce as much as we would like them to produce. And finally, before I get back to you, Isabel, I remember also I was in Cairo after the demonstration in Egypt, and I was talking to 2 activists of young people who are actually have like millions of followers on Facebook and different outlets, one Wael, one Ahmed. And, they were extremely energetic. They're going to change the world. And then I asked them question, what's your plan? And unfortunately, they don't have the plan. They don't have that strategic thinking of how to change the ecosystem, how to really work with the political system. So it's my message always is the administrative industry of Tahrir Square is not governing. So for young people to be able to really take their agenda, either work or empowerment or being, they need to plan and they need to be strategic and they need to really, so that's why probably the notion of youth movement around youth employment is not easy. And the other dimension, because they don't choose their battle sometimes correctly, they come across as a threat. And that's not smart. You need to really choose your battle. You need to know the jargon. You need to understand the political dynamic. So there's a lot to be done in this area in terms of empowering young people to lead change. But I believe COVID is a window of opportunity, and I will talk later about it in the second part of the remark. I will stop here, Isabel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting. So this is a movement that has basically, we forget about how important this technological disruption has been on employment because we're so focused on today, on COVID, but also the fact that it's a movement that did not have a plan, different to the nutrition story. So we have all these different stakeholders that need to come together. And from the three presenters, we have different ways of thinking about it, which are very creative and give me a lot of optimism, but also the gaps where a scaling up framework would help to think about those gaps. We had a question for you, Jeremy, about what advice you have to other sectors beyond nutrition who are scaling up a multi-sector approach?
That's a great question. I think, okay, I can think of 3 or 4 areas that one needs to think about. First of all, to convince sectors that they should be working together for a common aim, sectors need to see the benefits. In the case of the Scaling Up for Nutrition movement, in the early days, the argument was that for every $1 you spend on a multi-sector approach, the country gets $16 back in increased productivity and in GDP somewhere down the line. It's not enough just to have policies and architecture. You also need additional resources to work together as sectors, resources for coordination meetings. And in addition, the sectors need to know how they have to work differently, what needs to change. That was definitely a big problem with the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. There was the assumption that sectors would just somehow magically become more nutrition sensitive in what they were doing, but they weren't clear how they could do that. And also clear targets of sectors working together. And it might seem really obvious, but if you're going for a multi-sector approach, you need to measure the convergence of those sectors and the coverage of convergence as well. How many of the population are having all the sectors working together through one or several platforms? And finally, you need evidence that the approach is actually having an impact. That takes time, obviously. But to sustain a multi-sector approach, that evidence has to begin to come through eventually.
Wonderful. So lots of ideas. One of them that we always think about in the Scaling Up community of practice is that scaling up is a transformation. And what Jeremy was saying makes me think, yes, each sector needs to in some way transform as well, which is a great segue to our next session. We've all been trying to keep COVID outside of the conversation. For now, we've succeeded, but we're going to go into that now. How has COVID affected these movements? So I would like to start offering a framework of how to think about it, and then asking you, the participants in the audience, to tell us, what do you think the challenge is today? So Smriti, could we share the screen? Thank you. Great, if you could go big, the slide, yeah. Okay, so this is a resilience framework from Celery, which I find very useful to think about COVID today. So when you have a shock, and at the top we have the shock, a stress into the system, that shock can last a short time or a long time, or it can be also a huge shock or a small shock. You know, we think of a threshold of when this shock is going to move us from one task to the other. So if you have a small shock, the task basically is one of coping and recovering, to go back to the status quo. This applies to the human body, it applies to systems, it applies to organizations. When the shock is more intense or longer, you need to adapt. You need to have incremental innovation that is going to take you to a slightly different system, but within the same curve. As you see, it's one curve inside the other curve, it's adaptation. But if the stress is long and it's very sort of system-wide, and it really, it's a large shock to the system, the real task is one of transformation. We're talking about a disruptive innovation. So and at that point, you really need to think about a completely different organization. You need to think about a completely different system. You need to think about using this disruption as a way to think about redefining, transforming the way that you've been either thinking about the world or working in the world. So with that, I want to go to questions, and you can, if you can please raise your hand, we will go one by one. There's on the participants, you can raise your hand. You press a button that says raise hand, and we will be counting the hands. So the first question is, do you think that today, with this COVID challenge and in the moment that we are today, do you think that our challenge or the challenge of your organization is to A, scale down and survive, B, adapt, pivot in preparation to scale, or C, transform before scaling? So those who think that A is the answer, scale down and survive, could you please raise your hand? Katie, you want to come in? One person. Okay, we have one person that thinks that the task is to scale down and survive. B, the task today is to adapt, pivot in preparation to scale. Please raise your hand if you think that B is the right answer. 1, 2. 21 people think that B is the answer. And now let's go to the third. Please raise your hand if you think that the task today is to transform before scaling. Very interesting. 12 people. So we have one person thinking that we just have to get through this, cope and survive. 21 people to think that we need to adapt, or your organization need to adapt, and 12 people to think that the task is of transformation. So with that, we're going to move, we can stop sharing screen, Smithy. So with that, we can move to thinking about COVID. I would love to hear from the panelists what they think in terms of the task. And where are most organizations in your sector today after COVID, and how has COVID affected the coalitions and the political consensus to be able to further the agenda in each of your sectors. So let's start with you, Amar. How has COVID-19 affected the movement and the political consensus on climate change?
So on COVID, it is the deepest, broadest crisis that we have faced since the Second World War. It has three phases: rescue and stabilization, dealing with the medical emergency and lives and livelihoods. But beyond that, where scale comes in is we need to think about recovery, and beyond recovery, we need to think about transformation. So in that kind of a sequence, we have to be able to anticipate what are the implications then for investment, policy, and finance. And talking about the actors that I'm most concerned with, and the one that we are working particularly closely with, the Green Climate Fund. In this agenda, it's extremely important to think about two sides of the equation. One is how to unlock opportunities that in some sense can drive recovery and multipliers in the short run, but that can also produce long-run benefits, including transformation and response to climate change. And one dimension on the climate change agenda that is particularly significant is how does then one mobilize the pools of finance that we need to bring about transformation at scale and speed. So from where I would come is, in this new world, we really have to rethink, in some sense, the international architecture to support this kind of pace and change. And COVID is in many ways a one-time challenge and a one-time opportunity. If we miss the opportunity of a better recovery, we will miss the challenge of climate change.
So the stakes are very high and the opportunity is huge. It's quite sobering to think about that. Yeah, thank you, Amar. Jeremy?
Hi, sorry. My computer's a bit slow. Again, really interesting, Amar, and certainly I think a lot of us have that sense that this is a unique opportunity for the world, surprisingly. In nutrition, in the world of nutrition, I think as soon as COVID hit, everyone involved in nutrition at the international level was scrabbling around thinking, what new guidance do we have to produce? How can we help? But at the same time, being very restricted in their access to countries in which they work and movement around those countries. That's certainly true for the international actors. So there was a real fear that all the services, or a lot of the nutrition services, would have to adapt to this new environment. People wouldn't be able to come so easily to get food or micronutrients or immunizations. And of course, the recognition that there would be a secondary impact of COVID too on livelihoods, which would, of course, ultimately impact nutrition. Now, there was a lot of doom and gloom about in the early months of COVID because of that, and a lot of projections about increases in rates of malnutrition and mortality. I would say, though, that a bit like the new variant famine with HIV 40 odd years ago, where there were predictions of catastrophe and disaster, this doesn't really seem to have happened yet in terms of levels of undernutrition. at least as far as we can tell. And we know that in Africa, actually, so far, the COVID crisis has been far less serious than in Asia and Europe and Americas. One thing that's occurred to me, and there's no evidence for this at all, but it's quite theoretical, is that with COVID, donors who finance nutrition, international donors, are less and less able to allocate financing through the international agencies, the UN and the international NGOs, because those agencies have less access to populations. They're less able to move around and deploy staff and teams, which means, theoretically at least, that donors will have to rely much more on local actors, local NGOs, local civil society, and of course, perhaps also invest more in direct budget support through government. Now, interestingly, I mean, that's a kind of potential adaptation and transformation to good effect, because one of the huge critiques of international aid, increasingly so over the last 10 years or so, has been the tendency for international donors to put so much resourcing through the international development system rather than through government, for varying reasons, including transparency and accountability and fear of the tabloid media, etc., etc. But it strikes me that this may be an opportunity to change the way the business is done to some degree, and to pursue more of a localization agenda, which is something that many people have been pushing for in recent years. I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to ask Elaine, who after Hisham, I'm going to ask Elaine Tinsley, who's in the room, to talk about this, Fado and Jeremy. And then I want to come back, Amar, to you, because you both mentioned the international architecture and how it needs to change. But basically, governments have been overwhelmed by COVID. First of all, COVID is an adaptive challenge that keeps on changing. We still don't fully understand it. Therefore, we don't fully understand the response that needs to happen. But also just reaching that last mile, whether in the informal sector or in remote villages, has been impossible for even the best of governments. And that's where what Jeremy was saying resonates so much with the work that we have been doing with Elaine, and I want to come back to her after Hisham. So over to you, Hisham. How has COVID affected the youth employment movement and agenda?
Thank you very much. I go back to the group of young people I mentioned at the beginning, and I see the second actually task that Larry sometimes talk about in his model is to prepare the environment. And I believe there is, in my opinion, there's no better environment than now for young people to raise their voice and to be in the driver's seat. I think on 3 levels. The first one is the host government and local supply chain changes. Second, in leveraging IT. And third, message to donors. So this group of young people sitting in the coffee shop, they may have probably a message. And the first one is, countries, we have seen a lot of thinking inward, not outward. And that's fortunate and unfortunate, because we want country to know that COVID somewhere is COVID everywhere. But actually giving the challenge that host governments are facing now, everybody is looking back into how can they support their local supply chain. In my judgment, that is a golden opportunity in a decomposed local system for young people to really experience and take a lead in entrepreneurship activities to solve part of their local problems. A while ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was talking to the deputy minister at the Ministry of Youth and Sport in Jordan. He told me that the ministry is overwhelmed of the number of inquiry by young people to the local council, local youth sport. They are happy to help and they want to volunteer, but we don't have the capacity to really channel this energy. So I think that's the first practical implication of how could young people take a lead in a movement, and how they actually grab this opportunity. Second, IT. I think IT actually, in many ways, there is a digital divide being created now between people who do have access to the internet and people who don't. But in a majority of situation, there is what happened in last 9 months in terms of digital transformation and digital application, either in education, in health, in campaigning, in awareness campaign, etc., is a golden opportunity. So young people need to look at this as an opportunity. What kind of specific upskilling they can take, and what kind of industry that can absorb more young people with specific skills. So this is where actually you can take a challenge and turn it into opportunity. And the last but not the least actually message is donors. We all have been working with donors, and we know that stretching to work with non-conventional, non-traditional youth movements or youth forums, the system is not designed to do that. From reporting point of view, from monitoring and evaluation, I'm not saying we have to adjust to not meeting certain standard and qualification, but if we really true to supporting young people and put them in the driver's seat as an agent for positive change, there should be some stretch from donors and implementing partner to really understand and work and communicate and nurture such movement in a way that they grow organically, locally, to solve local problems. Otherwise, I mean, we keep circulating resources within certain group of NGOs or actors or host government. So these are the three messages that I actually would like to convey. Thank you.
I totally agree with you, Isham, absolutely. So I think we are hearing from each of the panelists a sort of common request or idea, which is the donors need to change. Maybe they need to transform, maybe they just need to change, but the architecture, the level of being able to finance the youth, at the level of being able to reach the last mile. So I wanted to invite Elaine Tinsley, who's not one of our panelists, but she's a participant. She co-chairs with me the Social Entrepreneur group within the community of practice. And I think it's very much, she's working in this space in a very creative way within a donor agency, so the World Bank. So Elaine, could you come in and comment on this?
Hi, Isabel.
Yes, come in.
For some reason, it allowed me to unmute myself, but then I didn't hear you at all because I think you ended up being muted. Can you repeat what your question was?
Yeah, so the question is how...
Oh no, I'm not hearing you at all.
Okay.
But okay, but let me talk a little bit about the social enterprise. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'll talk a little bit about the social enterprise and how their reaction to COVID has been. I think what we've seen has actually been quite phenomenal. There are two types of social enterprises. Ones that are, I mean, there's many types, but I think in truth, the response to COVID has been a little bit different. Many of them have actually stepped up. They've been very good at stepping in and saying, we need to address this urgent humanitarian crisis. We need to come in. They've done a lot on the awareness side. And I think one of the key things with social enterprises has been their ability to address, to work on the trust that they have within their communities to be able to spread awareness. Especially we saw that in the slums in Kenya, where they were able to set up systems and information systems and hotlines so that people could have very accurate information about how to react to COVID, what to do if they felt sick, where to go, and all the different types of information, because it's very easy to have misinformation in these kind of communities. And so I think they had to adapt their operations. They had to actually focus a lot more on collaborations with other social enterprises and government entities and donors. They had to reach back to their donors as well to say, for those who were getting money from donors to provide services, a lot of it had to be transformed too. So they had to renegotiate the metrics that had to be done, especially like in education. So rather than having in person, a lot of it went online. So it's like, how can you reach more students online. And so that's, I think what you were referring to, Isabel, was the terms of how can donors respond. And they definitely have to be a lot more flexible. And maybe this is something that can happen a little bit beforehand when we're setting up contracts with these entities, to know that there's like a bit of contingency there that can be relied on in case there is an emergency, that allows things to automatically kick in, so that time isn't wasted trying to say, oh, will we, if we do this, will we get paid for it, and not having to worry about that. But let there be an understanding beforehand that yes, these things are going to be built in. So I think we see a lot of social enterprises being able to do that and achieve that. And actually, it's been very interesting to see like how the activities that they've done. And we're hoping that this will lead to increased collaboration between social enterprises and governments, social enterprises and donors, so that in the future we can expand and scale up activities of social enterprises in collaboration with governments, because I think this is the thing that hasn't been as strong as the potential for it to be. And so once we can kind of, in a way, this epidemic is a way to kind of strengthen this kind of tie for each to realize the benefit of each other, and so that in the future we can kind of build up more impact and more scale with these kind of collaborations. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a question by Olaf Westerman for the panel. How do you align a traditional project programmatic approach to development change that most donors pursue? So I think that's very related to the question of the changes that have to happen in the donor space, the architecture question. So why don't I go back to the panelists with that question? How do you align or not traditional project program, and what needs to change about that? So let's start with you, Amar.
Sorry.
Sorry, I have changed the international architecture, which is what you mean.
Yeah, I can speak, but I can't unmute my video. So let me say that, you know, in the area of climate, the big requirement really is to build sustainable infrastructure as the foundation for both climate and for development. So for the donor community, the challenge essentially is to be able to provide the support that is needed in a more programmatic way, and to ensure that in some sense the financing that is provided is, you know, is able to leverage particularly private finance, because that's where the big potential for scaling up finance lies. So so the two areas that in this space that are really being researched right now is the idea of country platforms, which is how can the different set of stakeholders come together to scale up at the country level in a more programmatic way. The G20, for example, has made this one of its priorities in terms of the follow-up on the eminent persons group. And the second is how can one, in some sense, set up international platforms that can support this kind of scaling up. And an example of that is the FAST Infra initiative, which is bringing together the development finance institutions and the private sector. And the Green Climate Fund also has set up a climate investment platform for such kind of scaling. So the new thing in the business is really this idea about thinking about platforms that can both bind players, that can in some sense improve transparency and replicability, and that can improve predictability through standardization and improvements in governance. So that's a very important innovative space in the climate area that will be tracked, I think, and that we have a lot of learning to do.
Very interesting. So the platforms would be hosted at the country level, and then at the international level, where would this be hosted? You're in mute. Now we can see you.
The idea is really to have both. So at the country level, you know, what we want to do is to bring together stakeholders in a way that serves like a virtuous cycle for scaling up. What does that mean? It means that governments must be clear about their strategies and about their plans. It must be clear what are the policy impediments that have to be tackled. For example, if there is mispricing, there are impediments, for example, to access in the renewable energy space, for example, predictability of pricing and the grid. You have to be able to go more wholesale and through, for example, aggregation. And you need to bring in the private sector at the ground level so they become now very important parts of this platform. So the idea is to experiment on such platforms now and to think about, as we learn the lessons, to replicate them, you know, in across countries. But that's the only way in which we can bring about system change in things like energy transition, you know, in scaling up on sustainable transport or cities and the like. So these are really very, very focused, programmatic way, and the platforms are, you know, fit for purpose. But in a similar way, you know, in order to create a structure so that the international community can predictably come in and partner, is there a scope for setting up platforms, for example, on specific areas like, let's say, renewable energy or cities, support of cities, you know, food and land use, ecosystem services, you know, where international players are brought together on a common agenda, and they are able then to support these country platforms, again, in a more predictable way. So these two pillars, I think, are quite innovative, but there's a lot of learning still to be done.
Thank you. So both Johannes and I are thinking of the same, which is this reminds us of the comprehensive development framework. Johannes, you want to come in on that? I don't know if we can have Johannes unmuted.
Yeah, no, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
So, Amar, that's great. And I'm a strong supporter. Actually, of course, the Sun movement is precisely, I think, designed to organize such a platform and has a track record. So I look forward to how that has gone. But, you know, as Isabel mentioned, we've tried this, of course, you know, in various ways. And so what are the lessons you take away from past efforts, including the Wolfensohn Comprehensive Development Framework, the World Bank, where we tried really quite hard, you know, with a lot of leadership from the top, at least in our organization. What lessons do you take away from that, and how would you do things differently today in actually implementing these platforms? Thank you, and over.
So I think, you know, maybe I haven't communicated quite effectively. This is not to do everything in an integration. So there's one theme which is integration, and that's very important. And, you know, maybe you do, and, you know, in the kind of PRSP and CDF frameworks, you know, which were experimented with, as you know, about, you know, now almost 15 years ago, the idea was to take this more comprehensive approach. But in this particular case, more than comprehensiveness, it is to bring together all relevant stakeholders around a common purpose, which requires, in some sense, coordination, predictability, and good governance. And particularly with much greater focus now on the private sector than on donor coordination. So, you know, the idea, for example, is if a country has a big programmatic investment program in energy, then can one set the long-term directives? Can one set the policy parameters? Can one set the, the investment and finance parameters in a way that you create replicability? And you, for example, just to make a particular point, local DFIs might be much better placed now to deal with project origination and aggregation, for example, on things like rooftop solar. So that's the innovation in this, which is, it's an adaptive kind of structure rather than a kind of rolled out PRSP from the World Bank or whatever. So it has to be ultimately anchored in and led by a country very much in the spirit of the CDF. But the difference really is it's much more focused on implementation and on the structure of finance.
Yeah. So it's focused on one sector. I was leading one of the pilots, the first pilot on the CDF on Bolivia, and the multi-sector dimension is one, but bringing all the players together is not easy. It's actually quite difficult. So I think some of the lessons from that would still apply to that dimension. Hisham, sorry. Yeah, come in.
Thank you so much. I look at this from two dimensions. The first one is the local, the role of local political leadership. I apologize. So the role of the political leadership in this regard, because I think sometimes messenger is much more important than the message, we like it or not. And also you see sometimes like initiatives start implementation before thinking about political championship and legitimize change, because scale as a movement needs a lot of political consensus, and many of the initiatives think about scale from project log frame perspective. They all overemphasize, because that's the donor system function, output, outcome, and they stop in the purpose and impact. Why? Because it goes beyond the framework of the project. So I think the most important takeaway is to have a very concrete, hard technical training for mid-level government, host government champions. Really, that is very, very important. I saw that in Egypt when I did some workforce scaling up. I saw that in different other MENA countries. So they need to own it. They need to understand how to really think of the end game. The second actually comment is about donors from that side, from this side of the equation. I have seen a lot of effort on a policy level to include marginalized communities, non-traditional part. There's still a lot to be done in terms of women and youth. And I think that should be done on the policy level. And there should be some resources allocated by donors through the implementing partner around training, not the traditional training, but training around advocacy, strategic communication, needs assessment, even facilitation that sometimes we take for granted. For youth to be in the driver's seat, they need to have that basic skills to articulate their needs and to foster change from within. That skills, that's a full-time job. So I think these are the two comments I see, that the local leadership championship role and the issue of embedding hardcore technical skills as part of the donor policy. Thanks.
Yeah, and thinking about government, people working at the front line in the government also as being, people who need to be empowered to do changes. I think it's such an important point. So Jeremy, we have a question from Susanna Rafali, but I also wanted you to complement your answer with the continuing on your idea of how international agencies have been unable to reach the last mile and what needs to change about that. Her question is how to improve predictability and accountability of international scaling up platforms towards nutrition challenges related to human mobility and towards food crisis driven by fragile states and extensive violation of human rights, especially in countries where the platforms have no focal points. Over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, nice, easy question. Thank you, Susanna. Obviously, in fragile states, it's very, very hard to pursue government-led multi-sector nutrition agendas. It's such a complicated. Oh, sorry. It would be nice to start my video. Sorry. There you go. It's such a difficult area. We have a huge discussion in nutrition about the so-called humanitarian development nexus and how to strengthen that, because I think it's 80% of our humanitarian programs in nutrition have taken place for 8 consecutive years or more. They become protracted crisis, and most of the resources going in to those countries are humanitarian resources, and therefore by definition short-term, and they focus on treatment of malnutrition rather than prevention. And the whole multi-sector nutrition approach is about preventing malnutrition, addressing the underlying causes which drive malnutrition. Treatment is a small part of that. So how you address that in these protracted crisis contexts? Well, it's very interesting. If you look at the resources in going into countries like Somalia and Yemen, the humanitarian resources, which are renegotiated every year, they are colossal and they are increasing. And yet, arguably, nothing changes. Nothing. There's very little government service strengthening. Most of the resources go through the UN, who also then become donors and pass on resources to NGOs, INGOs, and NGOs. It's very, very duplicative. It's very wasteful. It's very expensive. The transaction costs are enormous. And from an FCAS and nexus strengthening point of view, there is an emerging lobby advocacy position, which is we have to do far better. We have these humanitarian resources can no longer just be short-term, annually negotiated. They have to be longer term, and they have to focus much more on the chronically vulnerable populations. There's this terrible blurring that goes on between those who are acutely affected by crisis and those who are chronically affected by crisis, and no distinction. And the implications in programming means that all the resources are going into treatment and nothing to prevent, and that can't continue. And it is ludicrous when you look at the spend. And if you're sitting in government, it looks even more absurd. As the Minister of Health for Somalia once remarked to me very angrily, the amount of humanitarian resources that comes in to his country every year would be enough to build the state of, it's equivalent to the GDP of Dubai. I think that was his comment. So sorry, I hope I've answered your question, or at least part of it.
And so related to that, on how the donor community needs to change in light of this opportunity that presents itself with COVID?
Sorry, I missed the last part of that, Isabel.
With the COVID shock.
With the COVID shock, I really think donors need to be thinking about resourcing directly through government much more than through the international system. And you know, organizations like the World Bank don't have difficulty in direct financing of government, and they know how to audit and set up financial systems which are robust and accountable. But our donors don't seem to, and are terrified that if there's any leakage of resources, the media will get hold of it and cause all manner of mayhem.
Yeah. Actually, in Afghanistan, we worked for years on a financial management system that would allow donors to put the money through the government rather than through intermediaries, and with all the ways that you mentioned. Yeah, it's a long process and not the most sexy of things to do, but really essential. Yeah. So I will invite, Amar will have to leave in a little bit. We have up to 10 to 25 or so. So we have around 10 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, if you could either raise your hand or include them in the chat, and we will be happy to weave them in the rest of the conversation before we close. So I have one question. There was in the participants, there was one person that thought that we really didn't need to adapt, not transform, but we just needed to cope. And I think that's a really interesting answer, and I would love to hear from that person if he or she wants. What was behind that answer? Is there anything we are missing by being all too focused on adaptation and transformation? No. Okay, here I have a question for the panel about the role of communication in changing norms, narratives, and assumptions to achieve multi-sector buy-in and consensus. What has worked? And the other one, echoing that, is what about the role of media, TV, radio, and social media in changing behavior at scale? Hisham, would you like to talk about that?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think media as a tool is very, very critical in terms of fostering change. But I remember I was part of a youth assessment in Libya, and we asked young people about social media, and it was also terrifying to know that 95% of the source of their information is coming from, platforms such as like social media platforms. So it's really sword with two edges, because also there is like misinformation going on sometimes in terms of social movement. So when you have youth, social media, political instability, put all these together, that could be also very challenging. So I think part of empowering youth leaders and activists to take the role of determining what they need for themselves and for their community is to really verify the source and make sure to overemphasize the accuracy of the message, and understand the audience and how to convey the message. That actually part of what I was talking about in terms of leveraging the resources and using the available tools. But nobody can ignore how critical is social media. I remember also, I don't know which country, and a young woman told me, do you think if it's 1950, the Arab Spring will happen? I said, that's a very provocative question, because she said, well, I can go into the street and be part of the demonstration because my family is conservative, but I can actually lead a few young people through a couple of tweets from my sitting room. So I think there is a very powerful tool, the media and social media, but how to use it is very important.
Yeah, we have come to see what a double-edged sword it can be, absolutely. Ana Maria Sanchez Rodriguez has a question. You want to come in? Ana Maria, come in. I think you are already unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm always interested about like whose need is to scale. like, because we talked about political consensus, and sometimes we sort of bring the need to scale without even reaching the consensus that we need actually to scale. So I really would like to know about your thoughts on this regard. And also, we talked about large scale projects, but I am sort of fascinated about the idea of scaling grassroots innovations or community social innovations, and the pathways to transfer those ones into, I mean, decidable policies. So that's it. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Who wants to answer the very tough question? Whose need is this to scale? Who are we focusing on as the originator? Anybody wants to answer?
I mean, in the case of youth, I mean, you need to always drive with the statistic and data. I mean, when you think about the scope of youth unemployment in certain contexts, I mean, you need to have some like boundaries about the country, the region, and you know, what is scale for a certain policymaker different than scale for others. So like, you know, 10% achieving employed 10% in certain country could be really very high scale to certain people and very low to others. So it's absolutely critical to have consensus about the purpose and the goal and whom we are targeting and which context and to which scale means. But sometimes people say, oh, you know, this program is targeting 5,000. As I mentioned at the beginning, successful youth employment theory of change is completely different. When you start to take that model into different contexts, cultural, organizational, you know, political, I think that scale is different. So each context has a different definition. So it's hard to give an answer. It depends on what people determine what's a scale for them.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think that's an easy question to answer for nutrition. You know, the treatment of acute malnutrition or wasting up until 2000, that's 20 years ago, covered only 1% of children who were wasted. 1%. With the advent of a new model of treatment, it went up to 20%, and that's where it's stuck. And that's where it's stuck the last 20 years. In fact, it's probably going down now. And that's just one facet of undernutrition. You know, there's also stunting and micronutrient deficiency. So there's no question scale is needed for nutrition programming.
Yeah, and the discontinuation between who this is for, the child, and the fact that they don't have a voice in the political space. So yeah, that's what you call it, the silent. Yeah. Isham, there's another question from Johannes. International donors have introduced a focus on communications with young people in the last 10 to 15 years, the bank, UNDP. What are they doing right? What are they doing wrong?
I think I answered that earlier. I think the messenger is much more important sometimes than the message. And actually, it's very interesting because Larry has a very interesting question about, like, is that resistance also related that people who are fostering change sometimes are perceived as an outsider, and that's why probably create some sensitivity? Absolutely, that's the case in many ways. That's why I think identifying, I mean, I think, you know, working with government has been always challenging. You come from the World Bank and you know, but I think building, I call it place-based approach, building on what is going on. I mean, every system has problems. So identifying local champions and have them lead the change and lead the scale and have that relationship between youth and policymakers. It's not artificial, but it should be real. But I think our role as a donor is to facilitate that discussion, not to really impose agenda. And it's easy, very easy for us to get into, no, I think it's right. You know, I think we have to focus on that because we are driven by, you know, pressure of numbers and pressure of, you know, as I said, output, outcome. But I think there are cases where I remember in Morocco, there was a couple of MCC and USAID and World Bank projects that focus on women empowerment and entrepreneurship that really stretch outside the comfort zone of the project. So it is absolutely possible. And to answer your question, Ioanni, about the media, I think, as I said, the answer is let people drive the change. Let young people be in the driver's seat and be, you know, young people are sincere. They feel it. If we come with an agenda, they feel it. Even if we try to manipulate that, I think the best and shortest answer is to really be sincere and honest about what can we, even if it doesn't, if it contradict what they have, just say it, put it on the table. This is the boundaries of the project. This is what we can, this is what we cannot. And young people will respect and own the change themselves. So that's my answer.
That's a beautiful way to end. And I think, Isham, the way that I was thinking as you were talking is, what we need to do rather than bringing a best practice from outside is actually tap into these movements for change in the country and actually help them get the capacity, but very much driven by the domestic agenda and the domestic politics. So with that, I want to thank all of the panelists. You have been fantastic. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I want to remind you that there's still another session on Friday, another plenary, and there will be other separate sessions for each of the 9 working groups in the next week. So if you haven't registered, there's still time to go through the workshop website. We will summarize all this. The recordings will be available and they will be all in this website that we are about to launch. This is the new website. The opening is October 30, www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. And for more information on the Community of Practice, you can email scalingcop@msiinc.com. And you will find a lot of really rich material, including the recordings from this session, which we have just completed. So thank you to everybody, and looking forward to more rich conversations in the rest of this COP annual event.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.